In my presentation, I'm going to be talking about combining two areas that are rapidly growing areas of health, areas in which my group specializes simultaneously, precisely because they work so well together, because they're synergistic. And way back when I did a job talk, and I was on the job circuit, and prior to being hired here, I actually gave this vision, and it's just so rewarding to see it coming about, this integration on the one hand of sensor data, on the other hand of dynamic modeling, particularly within the health area. So we're going to talk a little bit about some components of it. I'm going to go light. This is a talk I've used elsewhere, and I'm going to go light on some components of it that I think we've covered adequately, and try to zero in on a few features that will be new. So folks will require me noting in a past presentation, motivation for a lot of my work is confronting these ever more complex health challenges with which the world struggles. These complex confluence of intertangled features of both social and health and character, interacting health conditions, pronounced disparities associated with many conditions, including mental health, life course impacts of early life insults and insults even in the womb that we know both from the literature and from some of our own data, and the need to sort of coordinate more effectively our healthcare systems as they come under a lot of funding pressure with the graying of the population in the emergence of multiple conditions in giving individuals. We also live in a world that's ever smaller from the standpoint of transmission of conditions, infections from one area of the world to the next. You look at Zika virus or MERS or SARS or these other emerging infectious diseases which were confined to certain regions of the world, which are now worldwide concerns. We're also working in an area where corporate actors such as the food industry and the tobacco industry remain much more nimble in many ways than their public health counterparts. Now, in these areas, to really grapple effectively with these areas, and particularly to formulate effective policy, we have to understand the fact that we're dealing with systems where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The problems confronting policy challenges in these areas cannot be reduced purely to understanding the pieces of the system. Just like if you want to solve traffic jams, the problems of traffic jams in Saskatoon, you're not going to be able to figure out how to solve it by enumerating and studying the axle types and the chassis types and the engine types of all the vehicles on the road. You're not going to be able to simply do it by studying the road geometry in certain places. You're not going to merely be able to understand it by studying the speed limits in different zones. It's really an interaction of a wide variety of factors. It's an emergent phenomenon. It can't be reduced purely to the parts, although the parts surely matter, but it's rather the result of an entangling of these different parts that give rise to distinctive phenomena. We talk about a traffic jam, and it transcends the individual cars. The individual cars contribute to it, but it's about something more than those cars in isolation, something more than the road geometry in isolation, etc. And the patterns that we see at a public health level and in response to intervention attempts are quite different from what would be expected for any one component of the system. And the relationship to those pieces is often very complex and mediated. It's what we call, at a technical level, a complex adaptive system. And if we're seeking to undertake policy changes that matter, to put it in the words of my colleague Jeff McDonald, if we seek fixes that stay fixed, we need to understand this complexity. And we need to understand it to anticipate the outcomes of interventions, say interventions to lower the burden of shingles in a population, understand how that might end up affecting shingles incidence in future years, but also chickenpox. We also need to understand these, we also need to often understand these systems in an effective way in order to understand the phenomena that we see, in order to understand the patterns that we see geographically and in terms of behavior over time. And for these purposes, policymakers, as well as researchers and policy analysts, increasingly turn to decision-oriented simulation models. These models represent kind of micro-worlds, replications of many salient features of the external world that capture some of the essential patterns and causal linkages. And they help us by reason through the implications for theories about what's going on out there in the world. By capturing that theory in a simulation, we can actually run the simulation and test the degree to which that theory is consistent with the empirical evidence. And we can also ask, once we develop some confidence in the simulation, we can ask counterfactuals. We can ask about policy regimes or interventions that we've never seen before. Maybe it's an outbreak response intervention, a response to an outbreak of childhood infectious disease such as measles or pertussis in a certain age group and intervening to stop that outbreak through a rush vaccination campaign. Or maybe it's the results of changes in the built environment that we hope will ripple through to behavior change and thereby to changes in weight over the medium term. Models help us take our theories, put them in a form that's explicit, put them in a form that can be shared and critiqued by multiple parties, and that can help us learn more quickly whether our theories that are trapped in our heads otherwise are consistent with the understanding of others and the degree to which they're consistent with the empirical evidence that's available. And help us understand the implications of the theory much more reliably than we could if we were just reasoning about them in our head. So to pursue this sort of work, we build models, and there's many types of models we build. And some of them, several people in the room are very familiar with these models. Winchell is a king of these models. These include individual-based models, which are provide detailed longitudinal information on particular individual over time and cross-sectional views of a population's health, as well as hybrid models that combine elements of system dynamics together with individual trajectories, as in agent-based models. And really, we're engaged in, often with these models, we're engaged in kind of theory building. And as such, often these days, our models are pushed to include more and more articulated theories. Just to pick two models that Andrew is familiar with, if we consider the model on which Dylan is working with suicidal ideation, or the models associated with alcohol use, those models are mechanistic models, like other simulation models. They depict certain dynamic hypotheses, these theories about how people proceed in terms of exposure to alcohol and risk of proceeding to a state of heavy use or dependence on alcohol, or the degree to which a person who suffers the slings and insults of life might be likely to proceed to successively more serious stages of suicidal ideation to the point of contemplation or even attempts. So these are models that involve theories of the world that are captured in the model. And these days, a lot of these models involve quite articulated theories. Theories that involve day-to-day behavior. say the interaction between someone smoking cigarettes and using e-cigarettes. How do e-cigarettes factor into the cigarette landscape? Do they help someone quit? Do they just provide additional exposure to nicotine to keep someone hooked to cigarettes? To what degree are they an easy way of getting nicotine fixes when cigarettes aren't allowed and fall by the wayside when cigarettes are? To what degree are they gateways to cigarettes? These are all provocative theories about interaction of cigarettes and e-cigarettes. And models can help us understand the implications of those detailed theories over time. My own preference here is to view models as thinking tools, as what Jeff McDonald calls thinking prostheses, tools that help us complement our limitations, like other prostheses, they complement our natural limitations. The fact we're not so good about thinking the implications of theories through in our head, and they help us, in particular, reason through the implications of our assumptions about the world by thinking them through more consistently, quickly, and thoroughly. And to compare, amongst other things, the implications of that theory to whatever empirical evidence we can bring to bear, to more quickly spot omissions in the theory, gaps, oversights, and outright errors, so that we can refine our thinking. So models here are tools to learn more quickly. And if a model fails to match empirical evidence, if it fails to match some aspect of experience of a stakeholder, it's not to be viewed as a failure of the model, but a success in terms that you've identified an opportunity to learn, to refine our thinking about the models. And models particularly help us, and this is key, think through impacts across multiple causal pathways. Think through across multiple lines of influence between factors, how the different pieces of a system work and how they might be affected by an intervention. So these models help us kind of advance our understanding. Now, a major barrier to building these models is the fact that while they're articulating detailed theories, say about alcohol use and about suicidal ideation, or say about vaccine adherence and attitudes towards vaccine and how that's affected by outbreaks of childhood infectious diseases, or perhaps the model captures aspects of physical activity that are influenced by the built environment and understanding how those ripple through to patterns of BMI over time and obesity. A lot of the things that we build into these dynamic models are hard to collect data on reliably. I apologize for the departure from the Queen's English, but we often have shortcomings in the literature on data on people's physical activity over location, even where they're spending their time, the impact of social context on their behavior, the ways in which their decision making is different in different environments, say different built environments, the degree to which they're exposed to different environments over time. And the challenges, from the standpoint of modeling, much of the challenges we're being pushed to build these models to inform policy. Look at the press releases that are being created, right? Even before the model is fully built, sometimes before it's conceptualized properly. Absent an understanding of these behaviors and exposures, it can sometimes be challenging to really quantitatively nail policy trade-offs, to really, with firmness, understand what's the trade-off between policies. So an example of this, which you've seen before under another guise, and that's part of the method in my madness here, is we might have a model where we seek to understand the impacts of housing interventions. And we're trying to understand how they impact obesity levels as well as other outcomes. And our model might build in a number of causal pathways shown here. A dynamic model posits certain connections between how that move affects perceived safety of a neighborhood and how that ripples through to moderate to vigorous physical activities, etc. And we actually have a model that's being built right now with colleagues at UCLA who are working very closely with the Department of Public Health and much of their work at childhood obesity. And we're looking at issues very much including the types of work that, or the types of factors that are being considered here. Healthiness of diet, sedentary behavior, aspects of perceived safety, and moderate and vigorous physical activity. So we build models that involve multiple causal pathways in order to understand the posit connections, to understand what will the implication of that theory for the impact of policies. Now my thesis in this presentation, and my thesis indeed in investing for years in this sort of work, is that the advent of big data in health, the types of data that are being talked about in this boot camp, will synergize with and fundamentally enable dynamic modeling. And it's not merely a one-way thing. Both will enable each other. So we talked about sources of big data early on, the 4 V's, and we've seen the IEP platform in its Ethica Health incarnation and many of its great features here. Now, where do these techniques that we've been talking about fit in? Well, it's in a number of particular areas. They can help us estimate parameters for simulation model. They can help us pin down the particulars of the assumptions we want to place into the dynamic model, involving, say, the frequency of visiting the bottle shop for individuals who have certain characteristics, the bottle shop being the location in Australia where liquor is dispensed. They help us understand the frequency with which people might commonly use e-cigarettes, cigarettes, and how those frequencies might vary in different contexts. The degree to which use of an e-cigarette tends to predispose someone to defer use of a cigarette or vice versa. So they can help in parameter estimation. They can help in calibrating a model and in testing whether a model reproduces patterns we see in the world. Not in terms of putting the data into the model, but in seeing what the data produces and seeing if it's consistent with the empirical evidence. The data collected by the smartphones can be ways of testing to what degree is the model producing data that are similar to what we see in the world. Data often about microbehavior or aggregations thereof. They can help us learn more effectively from interventions. This is going to be one of my big pushes. And they can help in correcting a model over time. They can help us build in short models that stay true to empirical evidence. So when new empirical evidence comes in, if the model is off base, they help us correct from this. Correct it back, bring it back, reground it. So I'm going to talk just a little bit of a glimpse of something that Aiden will expand on further, but which I think is kind of an exemplar of this sort of work. And Aiden will give you a little bit of additional information about this, but it's a testament to the strength of his work, both in terms of the smartphone-based work and some of the modeling. So we had built a number of years back a student from Johnson Shoyama School, who's named Sarah McPhee Knowles, worked with a student in my group whose name was Wan Yi An, to build a dynamic model. It was an agent-based model that was designed to understand some of the ways in which policy related to foodborne illness and outbreak response in foodborne illness, the way in which that might affect the burden of foodborne illness. Okay, foodborne illness is a surprisingly common phenomenon, but it's one that's underobserved. It's believed that only something like 0.5% of all cases of foodborne illness are reported. What that means is about 1 every 200 cases of foodborne illness are actually recorded by the health system. Okay? There's a lot of people getting sick who from eating food at vendors of various sorts, being exposed to pathogens like E. coli, salmonella, and a number of others that circulate within the food system, and become ill either for hours, the better part of a day, or in some cases for weeks. For things like salmonella and E. coli, it can be for weeks. Okay, in this model, we were interested in simulating the effects of foodborne illness outbreaks and the way in which policy regimes affected them. So we had a time horizon of about 27 years, and there were agent populations consisting of consumers, food vendors, and inspectors. Okay, and it was a spatially explicit environment. It was an environment where we had individuals circulating over space. Now, if we were to kind of map out a lot of the causal connections here, we have a number of factors. So here's risk awareness, and risk awareness affects risk perception, and that might affect seeking food at vendors. Not all of these things are in the model, but right now. But these are ones that I think might end up being incorporated further. There's impact of weather on things like uncontaminated vendors. You think about food trucks, for example. In hot weathers, the falafel is more likely to make you feel awful. And these things end up affecting exposure to contaminated food, which can lead to subclinical illnesses and clinical illnesses. Only clinical illnesses, a subset of clinical illnesses are reported to public health. And it's a pretty large fraction. So if you go and you see a doctor, you go to the hospital. Some of us in this room have been in this unfortunate state. The hospital will write it up and often report this to public health that this is likely to be a foodborne illness case. And if they get enough of those reports, over a certain period of time, they'll declare an outbreak. And this is one of the areas where public health inspectors are most active. They will switch from a routine investigation mode where they're going around kind of in a round-robin way, checking restaurants, to an outbreak investigation state where they'll start to investigate. They'll identify contaminated vendors and hopefully take corrective action through fines and through warnings, and in some cases by shutting them down in a way that will expose people to less risk in coming days and weeks and hopefully years. Just give a sense of a dynamic model like this. We have consumers who go between several states. So this is the original model. We have health, illness, exposure, and a person could be in a healthy state at a given time, an illness, a state of exposure to illness, and then after some incubation period, which differs dramatically for different pathogens, we might have outcomes that are clinical and subclinical. I should note that this state of exposure, where one is still in an incubated state, it's not yet manifesting symptoms. This can last from hours, a couple hours, 2 to 3 hours, for acute food poisoning, to a case where it can last for days. Okay, and with things like E. coli and salmonella, you can actually require days for it to kind of sit in your gut, start to breed, and by the time you get sick, you stay sick for weeks often. Okay, really, really sick. By contrast, there's other types of pathogens which just lead you to be exposed to toxin. They're not breeding in your gut. You've eaten the toxin, and you have short-term adverse result from that. Food vendors in this restaurant are another agent. They go between a case where the restaurant is not contaminated to where it's contaminated. And the idea here is that the transition from a contaminated restaurant back to a safe restaurant is contingent upon it being found and remedied by an inspector. By contrast, I think in the latest version of the model, the transition from safe to contaminated is just a probabilistic transition. It's just associated with a hazard rate, a certain chance per unit time. And the inspector goes through a set of different mechanisms. And again, this differs a little bit by version of the model, but basically they go between routine inspection, checking out particular vendors, to a case where they're going to start investigating an outbreak. They sort the reports to prioritize them, and they engage in some outbreak investigation. Now, in the model, the model was somewhat stylized by the standpoint of these agent-based models. It wasn't depicting Saskatoon in all its particulars, nor Regina, nor Vancouver. It was a quite general model. It was kind of a thought piece model. And there were a lot of pieces of it that needed to be pinned down. For example, the degree to which risk perception plays a role in care seeking, or excuse me, and seeking food at vendors. The degree to which, the news of a possible outbreak may limit people's going and seeking food. The degree to which exposure to contaminated food leads to subclinical illnesses. They're kind of the hidden part of the iceberg. We know there's probably a lot of people getting sick out there, but we don't know how many. And for a given outbreak, probably a whole lot of people have gotten sick, but they're kind of the dark matter. We don't know how many there are out there. And then we don't know, in terms of accuracy of recall, this is very important for how quickly the investigation can secure closure, can actually identify the bad restaurant. And we don't really know too much about how accurately people recall the foods that they've eaten or where they've eaten. All right? So that was a bit of the model. That model pre-existed this work on that Iden is doing, but it helped stimulate the work that Iden is pursuing. So in order to investigate many of these factors, we launched a study. This was together with Cheryl Waldner over at the School of Public Health, and it ran last year. It had kind of a pilot in the fall, and then a series of two groups of about 80 people total that were followed in the spring. Iden's going to be talking more about it, so I won't go into it in detail, but I'll just highlight that we had a couple buttons here. One was to report feeling ill, and here they could indicate whether or not they consulted a healthcare professional. This could help us clue into how much the burden of subclinical illness is. How many of these cases of feeling ill lead someone to actually go present for care? Mind you, a person may feel sick for other reasons, but if we start to zero in on foodborne illness, just knowing something about care-seeking behavior can be very important. And we asked them to report the particular symptomology, which is important because only some of these are likely to be highly specific to foodborne illness. In addition, they could record when they ate. And Iden has done a great job in pulling together some data. This gives the frequency of reporting per day, and I believe this is based on individuals, and this was partway through the study. I think this was after 1 month of the study or something that you pulled this together. I think you're trying to update these, but yeah. So this gives a sense of sort of how many people were reporting items on average 5 times a day, 3.5 times a day. These are food items that they are being asked to photograph, and you can see there's actually a large number who are reporting more than 1 per day. 1 is common, and then there are some that were not reporting. They're reporting with this interface. Take a photo of the food, and they indicated what sort of food it was. This helped us distinguish how much they were eating out and the nature of that food. For example, were they eating pre-processed food, which is sealed containers, and is very unlikely to yield adverse foodborne illness results, versus cases where they were eating at a restaurant or eating takeout from a restaurant. And we were asking via EMAs, we were asking questions about the degree to which they encountered illness that they didn't report to us with a button, or the degree to which they were exposed to food from outside. So we had asked if they ate in a restaurant today, or ate ready-to-eat food, or take or leftovers, etc. And one of the amazing things was the level of response. Mohammed had indicated it, but I think it's a testimony to Cheryl and to Aiden that what we're seeing here is, in terms of participants, this was again a month into the study, but it lasted, this general pattern lasted through the study, where most participants had 90% or more of the questionnaires answered as part of the study. So when they were asked these questions, they were very, very careful about filling them out in large numbers. And just to have a sense of this, these are examples for a particular person answering reports of illness, reporting what they had, whether they sought care for it, etc. And in estimating that dark matter, the number of people who get sick but don't go to the doctor, this starts to be pretty important. And we've seen before that audio can report, it can be used to report the nature of the food as well. This was, I think, as of about 1 month into the study, we had very large amounts of data recorded. So in this case, it was reporting across the 80 people, somewhere upwards of 90 million accelerometer records, etc. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. So from this data, we can start to create these trajectories. And you folks had seen trajectories like this before, where they've eaten food at home, eaten food at other places, and then cases of illness over time for different individuals here. And in different lines of our work, we're using recurrent events analysis to examine data of that general type. Arash will likely move to examine exactly that sort of data sometime in coming weeks. But in addition to that, we have the geomapping. And I shared this before, where they reported eating non-home cooked food, and then within 24 hours before their illness. So which of these spots where they reported eating food not cooked at home, were they eating 24 hours before a reported illness, for example? Okay, so a study working on a similar area to the model, how do these two come together? Well, just as a reminder, the model is capturing dynamic hypotheses involving a set of factors here. We have to put into the model very specific assumptions, very particular assumptions about this relationship, say, between accuracy of recall and how it affects the investigation, or exposure to contaminated food and how many subclinical illnesses that were. These were key things that go into the model that affect the findings from the model, that affect the outcomes of the model, the effectiveness of interventions, the amount of burden that we believe to be relieved through certain interventions. Now, traditional data sources filled this in with some things. We could get information on things like the number of cases reported to public health, the number of vendors identified as contaminated, and the occurrence of warmer weather. What we could get in the context of the data collected from smartphones was data on a lot of pieces that otherwise were latent, were hidden. We didn't have good data on. So information, for example, on risk awareness or perception, attitudes towards care seeking. There were quite a few questions asking about knowledge and attitudes towards risk associated with certain types of foods, such as organic foods or foods that were prepared and through alternative food chains. We could look at the degree to which, using geospatial information and self-reports, as well as cross-checks and questionnaires, the degree to which people were seeking food at vendors. We really weren't sure. This was a cohort of 80 people. We weren't sure how frequently would they be going and eating out. And to the degree they were eating out, to what degree were they eating processed foods of low risk or restaurant foods? How about eating leftovers, which are very high risk often? We were interested in looking at that issue, and the data from the phones could fill in some components here. Could help us fill in this issue of subclinical illnesses. How many illnesses out there are people experiencing that they're not reporting to the healthcare system? Mind you, not all of those illnesses necessarily are coming from foodborne sources, but by getting a sense of the magnitude of this, it can help pin down that aspect of the model, and the model might also take into account some additional sources of illness, something that Aiden is working on, I think, as part of his plans with the model. We can also collect information on clinical illnesses, not all of which are reported to public health. And critically, and this is one of the most important, we could look at this issue of how accurately do people, in fact, recall what they ate. And this is one of the big goals of the study, is trying to pin down to what degree are the individuals able to recall things from 3 weeks ago, like they'd be asked by a public health inspector in outbreak mode. They might be asked, what did you eat 3 weeks ago? Where did you eat lunch? Where did you eat dinner? You know, in 3 weeks ago from today, where were you eating? How about 3 weeks ago from yesterday? Did you eat at home? Did you eat at a vendor? What did you eat, etc.? So we were able to look at this issue of accuracy of recall, which is another key area of assumptions about the model. So in short, this data can inform the model in several areas. One is parameter estimation, trying to understand what fraction of cases are clinical and subclinical. Another is duration of symptoms, how commonly they last for days versus they're shorter, how frequently they're going out and eating at home or elsewhere. So we can help fill in terms of parameters, certain aspects of that model that otherwise might be difficult to gather from the literature or to gather from public health data. Another component is it can help us learn from intervention effects. So the key point here is that that with dynamic models, we can typically, we will typically be hypothesizing about the, well, actually, there's two components. I misspeak here. There's two components of this learning from intervention effects. One of these that we examined in a paper, which is part of a volume by George Kaplan, and that involves Kurt just Sarah McPhee-Knowles and myself for that one. We examined what would the impact be of a mobile technology being used to inform intervention. So here we used a model, a dynamic model, to ask a what-if question. If we had the ability for individuals to report to public health subclinical symptomology and report to public health a record of their eating places, perhaps by looking at their GPS and crossing it with food vendor locations. If that information were available to public health for a small segment of the population, let's say 1% of the population, or 4% of the population, or 8% of the population, if public health folks who run the food inspections had recourse to information on subclinical symptomology and where people ate, the people who reported the symptomology, where they ate, to what degree would that actually affect the burden of illness by virtue of the fact that public health is better able to guess where the illnesses were coming from, which restaurants were giving rise to them? So the idea is public health has this new source of information and can act on it. How much does that end up lowering the burden of infection? And so here, the model was being fed with some assumptions. We were positing the availability of a technology. We weren't specific about the technology, but an Ethica type system could fit the bill exactly. And we were looking at what would the impact be on subclinical illnesses. And what we saw was a remarkable decrease with only 4% sentinels in the population. What I'm saying by that is, if you have a population where 4% of the people were willing to offer up information, either in escrow or on an ongoing basis, about when they were feeling lousy, and they were willing to let their GPS information be seen by the public health authorities as part of outbreak investigations or outbreak triggering, then we could reduce the burden of infection by something like 60% from the model. This is based on data from food going, et cetera, from the literature, food seeking. It was not specific to Saskatoon, but it was based on some generic numbers that were used from the literature that we placed into the model about a variety of factors, and we examined what the implications would be for that policy regime. So in short, what this suggested is, if public health authorities were to use a technology such as this to help more quickly identify and more quickly snuff out cases of foodborne illness, there could be a dramatic reduction in cases of foodborne illness by less than halving them. But a second use of these sort of models together was what leverages their idea of thinking tools. And the idea here is to try to help us learn more quickly from interventions. So the idea is that with a model, we are often trying to understand how much an intervention would affect things. And the effects of that intervention within the model are often simulated through multiple pathways. So we'll have multiple pathways to affect here. Some of the burden will be spent subclinically, some clinically, or for the case of a move to a mixed income neighborhood, there'll be several different pathways by which this carries effects. And a given simulation model will be simulating all of those pathways at the same time. It will actually posit components and linkages here across different pathways. A model here might simulate multiple of these pathways. And the idea here is to use smartphones, the data collected by smartphones, to help cross-check the model's anticipated, what the model anticipated as being the effects of an intervention, by comparing that with actual empirical data about the impact of the intervention on those pathways. Both the model and the smartphones here can collect data or help us understand data relevant to particular pathways. And the goal is to cross-check them so we can learn more effectively from the effects of the intervention. And the idea is to try to help distinguish which pathways are the major drivers for outcomes, the primary reasons for the lack of intervention success or in fact observed success, which of these pathways are working, which of them are working at cross purposes, which are working synergistically, and help understand the effects from the intervention on other groups and the downstream effects. So here, we will have a model that depicts these pathways, and we'll be able to cross-check the model using data at multiple points so that we can learn from the interventions more effectively. If we had a model of move to mixed income neighborhood, we'd be able to study impacts, yes, on gross outcomes such as obesity, but we'd be able to look at the intermediate pathways and check the degree to which the model anticipated outcomes of that intervention are consistent, whether inconsistent with the empirical evidence. And this can help us build a better model, identifying shortcomings in the model, but also help us identify ways that we can improve this intervention. Because the hallmark of dynamic models, their foremost thing that people we'll use them for. The single most common thing, they can be used for dozens of purposes, but the single most common thing is to try to identify more effective interventions, to try to identify interventions that offer the biggest bang for the buck or the greatest leverage or what have you. So here, the idea is that we can take the outcomes from the model, compare it with what's actually observed when an intervention is in effect, use both to improve, to learn. Use both to learn, okay, where did the intervention fall short, and where is the model falling short, so we can build a better model. We can tweak the model to better accommodate, to better incorporate the understanding from the data. And then we can use the model to ask what-if questions about alternative interventions. What if we were to change the intervention in this way or that way? What if we were to affect, to change recruitment strategy? Or what if we were to change the rollout, the implementation science side of the intervention? Or suppose we were to try to place a better emphasis on building the social networks needed to mediate the effects of this intervention, what would the impacts be? In short, both models deal with individual pathways and causal mechanisms. Smartphone data allows us to peer into these mechanisms and causal pathways. And by leveraging the two, by comparing the results and incorporating the findings from one to improve the other, we can end up evolving towards interventions that are more reliable, that yield better outcomes, and that can help us identify or reach our policy goals more reliably. Okay, I'm not going to go into this. I will just say ubiquitous sensors and dynamic models here are a natural synergy. The dynamic models help us make sense of the data for policy, and the electronic source data, at its most basic level, it helps ground these models. It helps us take these models, tie them down with empirical data at a micro level, at the level of individual health behaviors over time, in a high velocity, high variety sort of fashion. And it can provide databases that inform model parameterization, things as prosaic as creating network structures in the simulation model that match those observed empirically, but also for calibration, where the simulation model is trying to reproduce the patterns seen in the empirical data through sort of smartphone and wearable-based data collection. These dynamic models can also help us cross-check. The empirical evidence can help us cross-check the model anticipated outcomes of interventions or of causal pathways over time in the absence of an intervention. Meanwhile, dynamic models have a huge amount to bring to bear. They can help us make sense of the implications of this data for downstream factors, for chronic disease, or for the potential of different policy regimes. They can help us understand the level of the frequency with which we need to sample data from electronically sourced data. This is an area where Kevin, myself, and Mohammed, as well as Winchell, have done some work. How frequently do we really need to sense things, or how frequently is it okay to deal with daily data, for example, as kind of representative of the whole data set? These are the sort of things we can use dynamic models to interrogate and arrive and scrutinize as to the desirability of different levels of data collection. They can identify sampling rates, and they can also generate synthetic data for testing out regimes for classifying from the data collected from smartphones. Okay, so some conclusions here. Empirically grounded models require data. To build models that that are likely to be able to yield quantitative insights at a precise level between policies. The types of data that we are collecting with commodity sensor-bearing devices to get joined together with the data collected via EMAs can really help inform, tie down, ground those simulation models. And coupled with the models, the sensor data can offer complementary health insights. The models can help us figure out how much data, how frequently we need to sample the data, and by contrast, the data can help us yield more reliable outcomes from the model. And joined together, they offer, in my view, tremendous potential for informing policy discourse. Now, it turns out that there's additional machine learning techniques that I haven't had time to cover here, and we're not going to have time to do in the boot camp, where you can leverage the incoming data as it comes in to correct for dynamic model inconsistencies. So you can take the emerging data and use it to kind of keep the model honest. So even a rough and ready model can be useful to look forward if it's constantly kept abreast and kept consistent with the latest evidence. And in a different line of work, we have successfully used that strategy for a variety of dynamic models. And one of the most powerful sources of data for that is data of the sort that we're examining in this boot camp, namely data from smartphones and smartwatches. And I think one of the most attractive ways of using models and smartphone data together is to learn more quickly from interventions. Whether successful or not, we can use models to try to cross-check the data that's received from the devices with what was expected by the model. We can improve the model with that, and we can use a model to ask, how would other interventions regimes, how would other intervention strategies change the results? How might they improve the results that we see here? More than that, we can use the data from the smartphones to evaluate which causal pathways are actually successfully changed, which of them are working at cross purposes, say cases where you increase physical activity, but you've also increased sedentary behavior during off times, and it can help us identify in what specific ways our interventions are falling flat. And that's an opportunity for learning. It's an opportunity for coming out of the intervention with a net gain in terms of identifying what the weak points are and being able to formulate the first step towards formulating better intervention strategies, which can be made much easier with a dynamic model. So in short, dynamic modeling and the types of data that we're talking about here, I view as kind of ideal partners in coming years and decades in terms of helping to inform policy discourse and health insights in many areas of the health sphere. And I hope this presentation provides a bit of a glimpse. I know it's been very quick and it's had to cover a new area, but I hope it provides a bit of a glimpse about why these two can work together so well. Okay, so that's all I'll be presenting here. And Kevin, do you want to give a presentation related to those couple natural experiments?
Well, it's a couple of slides.